Justice delayed is justice denied. You've heard this phrase before, right? But what if I told you that the book of Nahum rewrites it with a chilling twist? Justice delayed is not justice denied. That's what this book is about. It's not a warning, it's not a plea for repentance, and it's certainly not an invitation to change. It's a verdict. Picture this, a nation so powerful that it crushed every enemy in its path. Its warriors were feared, its cities impenetrable, and its wealth limitless. Nineveh, the mighty capital of Assyria, seemed invincible, but God had seen everything. Their cruelty, their arrogance, their blood-soaked empire built on the bones of the weak. And now their time was up. What makes Nahum's prophecy so terrifying? Unlike Jonah, there's no second chance, no call to repentance. The judgment is final. God had once spared Nineveh when Jonah preached repentance, but they squandered that mercy. Now there would be no escape. The question is, why did God wait? And why does this matter for us today? Could this same judgment be waiting for nations today? Could the empires of our time, powerful, wealthy, seemingly untouchable, be standing on the edge of destruction without even realizing it? What happens when a nation refuses to change, when it mistakes God's patience for His approval? We put timestamps for each section in the description, so you can easily go to the topics that interest you the most. If this deep Bible stories video gives you a fresh perspective, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget, we've converted our most popular videos into eBooks, so check the link in the description. If you'd like this video in ebook format, let us know in the comments. Now let's step into the pages of Nahum and meet the man chosen to deliver the final words to a dying empire. As we leave the thunderous opening of Nahum's prophecy, it's time to ask, who was this prophet? Who was the man chosen to deliver such a terrifying message of doom to one of the most feared empires in history? To understand Nahum, we need to dive deeper, not just into his life, but into his name, his mission, and the world he lived in. Because in a twist that seems almost ironic, Nahum's name means comfort or consolation. But how could a man preaching judgment and destruction possibly bring comfort? Let's find out. First, Nahum was from a small, forgotten town called Elkosh, a place so obscure that historians still debate its exact location. Some believe Elkosh was near modern-day Israel, while others think it could have been closer to modern Iraq. Wherever it was, Nahum did not come from power, influence, or prestige. He wasn't a king's advisor or a wealthy merchant. He was an ordinary man sent to deliver an extraordinary message. And that message wasn't just dangerous, it was outright deadly. You see, Nahum lived during a time when Assyria was at its peak. This was no crumbling empire gasping for breath. Assyria was a terrifying superpower known for its brutality. They didn't just conquer nations, they annihilated them. They burned cities to the ground, impaled prisoners on stakes, and exiled entire populations. To speak out against Assyria was like standing in front of a tidal wave and daring it to stop. But Nahum wasn't afraid. His message wasn't rooted in politics or rebellion, it was rooted in God's justice. And that justice had been brewing for over a century. You see, more than 100 years earlier, God had sent Jonah to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, with a warning. Back then, Nineveh repented, and God spared them. But that repentance didn't last. Within a few generations, Nineveh had returned to its old ways, worse than before. By Nahum's time, Nineveh had become a symbol of unchecked power, arrogance, and cruelty. They believed they were invincible, untouchable, unstoppable. But God had seen every act of violence, every injustice, every betrayal. And now, Through Nahum, he was saying, enough. This brings us back to Nahum's name, comfort. How could a prophet preaching destruction be a symbol of comfort? Because Nahum's message wasn't just about Nineveh's fall, it was about God's faithfulness to his people. For generations, the people of Judah had suffered under Assyria's oppression. They had seen their cities destroyed, their loved ones taken captive, and their land trampled underfoot. Nahum's prophecy was a reminder that God sees, God remembers, and God will bring justice. So did Nahum live to see Nineveh's fall? We don't know for certain, but we do know that his prophecy came true in stunning detail. In 612 BC, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the great and mighty capital of Assyria, was utterly destroyed. It fell so completely that historians couldn't even find its ruins for centuries. The empire that once ruled the world vanished overnight. But Nahum's message wasn't just about ancient history. It's a message for every generation. It's a reminder that no empire, no leader, and no nation is beyond God's reach. Pride comes before the fall, and justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. As we move deeper into Nahum's prophecy, we'll see exactly how God's judgment unfolds and why this ancient warning still echoes in our world today. Buckle up, because the fall of Nineveh is just the beginning. Nahum's prophecy is about destruction, but before he even mentions Nineveh, he gives us a terrifying vision of something far greater, the wrath of God. This is not the soft, tame image of God that modern culture often promotes. This is not the distant, indifferent deity who merely wishes people would do better. No, this is God as a warrior. This is the Almighty whose patience has reached its end, whose justice will no longer be delayed. The world has mistaken his mercy for weakness, and now they will see just how powerful he truly is. Nahum's opening chapter doesn't read like a traditional prophecy. It reads like a war hymn, like thunder rolling across the heavens, shaking the very foundations of the earth. This is not just about Nineveh. This is about who God is when his justice can no longer wait. The Lord is slow to anger but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. Nahum 1:3. These words should comfort the faithful and terrify the wicked. Slow to anger, but great in power. God's mercy is vast, but so is his justice. He waits, he warns, he calls for repentance, but when the time comes for judgment, there is no escape. Nahum paints a picture so vivid, so dramatic, that you can almost hear the storm breaking over the horizon. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. Nahum 1:3. This is a God whose presence is like a hurricane, whose judgment is as unstoppable as a tidal wave. The most powerful forces of nature, storms, earthquakes, floods, are nothing compared to him. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Nahum 1:4. The very elements that sustain life, water, rain, rivers, can be wiped away in an instant by the mere breath of God. The message is clear. Nothing can stand before him. Then Nahum takes it further, describing the complete and total terror of the Lord's presence. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. Nahum 1:5. Can you picture it? The strongest, most immovable parts of creation, mountains themselves, crumble before him. If the mountains can't stand before God, how can Nineveh? How can any kingdom, any leader, or any nation that mocks his authority? And then comes the question that every sinner should fear. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger. Nahum 1:6. The answer is chilling no one. This is where Nahum's message is different from Jonah's. When Jonah went to Nineveh, there was still hope for repentance. But now it's too late. God's patience has ended. The people of Nineveh had their chance a century ago, and they wasted it. Now all that remains is judgment. Yet in the middle of this terrifying vision of wrath, there is a moment of hope, but only for those who trust in him. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him, but with an overwhelming flood he will make an end of Nineveh. Nahum 1:7-8. Here is the contrast: destruction for the wicked, but protection for the faithful. Nahum is reminding God's people, those who have suffered under Assyria's cruelty, that they are not forgotten. For them, God's justice is a comfort, not a threat. This pattern of wrath and refuge, destruction and salvation is not unique to Nahum. It mirrors the final judgment in the book of Revelation. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb." Revelation 6:15-16. Just like in Nahum's vision, the earth itself trembles before God. Just like in Nahum's prophecy, there is no escape for the wicked. So what does this mean for us today? Nahum's words are not just ancient history. They are a warning, a reminder that God's justice is still coming. Nations may grow powerful, leaders may act as though they are untouchable, but no one is beyond the reach of God's judgment. The same God who brought down Nineveh will bring down every empire that defies him. And yet there is also a promise for those who trust in him. God is a refuge. In the middle of the storm, in the face of the whirlwind, those who belong to him will be safe. The question is, where do you stand? Will you be among those who seek refuge in the Lord? Or will you be among those who learn, too late, that no one can stand against his wrath? As we move forward in Nahum's prophecy, we will see exactly how Nineveh's destruction unfolds and why it was so complete that historians couldn't even find its ruins for centuries. Judgment is coming, and when it arrives, there will be no escape. Nahum's prophecy wasn't just words, it was a sentence of death, and the execution was swift, brutal, and absolute. Nineveh, the mighty capital of Assyria, the city that once laughed at its enemies, would be wiped off the face of the earth. The empire that had terrorized nations for centuries, the kingdom that thought itself invincible, was about to learn a terrible lesson. No one defies God and survives. Nineveh was more than just a city. It was a fortress, a symbol of power so great that no one believed it could fall. Its walls towered 100 feet high, stretching for miles, reinforced by thick stone and guarded by an army feared across the known world. The Tigris River flowed alongside it, providing natural defense and endless resources. Assyria had crushed Babylon, humiliated Egypt, and brought Israel to its knees. They were unstoppable. But then Nahum spoke. "The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and idols that are in your temples. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile." Nahum 1:14. It sounded impossible. No power on earth could conquer Nineveh. But Nahum wasn't speaking about human power. He was speaking about divine justice. The siege begins, Nineveh's worst nightmare. In 612 BC, it happened. The Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians, nations that had once feared Assyria, joined forces for one purpose: to erase Nineveh from history. They surrounded the city, cutting off its supplies. But Nineveh still believed it could outlast them. They had food, weapons, and walls no army had ever breached. But Nahum's prophecy had spoken of something more terrifying than soldiers. The river gates are thrown open and the palace collapses. Nahum 2:6. For centuries, historians debated whether this was poetic imagery, until archaeologists uncovered the truth. The Tigris River, once Nineveh's protection, became its downfall. Heavy rains caused the river to rise, and the floodwaters smashed through the city's defenses. The walls that had stood for generations crumbled, leaving the city vulnerable. The Babylonians and their allies stormed in, slaughtering everything in sight. Nahum's prophecy was being fulfilled, detail by detail. Nineveh is like a pool whose water is draining away. "Stop! Stop!" they cry, but no one turns back. Nahum 2:8. Can you picture it? A city in chaos. Warriors running through the streets, blood soaking the stone pathways, screams rising above the sound of fire and falling walls. The people of Nineveh had once celebrated as they destroyed other nations. Now they were the ones begging for mercy. The king of Nineveh, once the most powerful man in the world, realized it was over. In despair, he gathered his wealth, gold, silver, treasures stolen from nations, and set fire to his own palace, choosing death over capture. Plunder the silver! Plunder the gold! The supply is endless, the wealth from all its treasures. Nahum 2:9. The Babylonians did exactly that. They stripped the city bare. Every piece of treasure that Nineveh had stolen over the centuries was taken from them in a single night. And then the unthinkable happened. Nineveh disappeared. For centuries, it was as if the city had never existed. Its ruins were buried under sand, forgotten by history, exactly as Nahum had predicted. "I will prepare your grave, for you are vile." Nahum 1:14. No other empire in history had fallen so completely. Babylon, Rome, Egypt, all had their rises and falls, but Nineveh, it was erased. Its very name became a whisper, a legend, a warning for today's superpowers. And that's where Nahum's prophecy speaks louder than ever. Nineveh was the most powerful city in the world. It thought it was invincible. It thought its wealth, military, and influence made it untouchable. Sound familiar? Look at today's global powers. Nations that boast of their strength, leaders who believe they can do whatever they want without consequence. The warning of Nineveh is a warning to every empire, every kingdom, every government that believes it can mock justice, oppress the weak, and stand against God. No nation is too big to fall. No leader is too powerful to be judged. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? Nahum 3:19. The world had suffered under Nineveh's cruelty for centuries, but when its judgment came, no one mourned. The same could be said for many nations today. What happens when the world stops fearing them and starts cheering their downfall? God's justice, slow, but never forgetting. Here's the final lesson of Nahum. God doesn't forget. It had been over 100 years since Jonah had preached repentance in Nineveh. Back then, the people had listened and God had spared them. But their children and their grandchildren went right back to their evil ways. They thought God had moved on. They thought his patience meant he had forgotten. He had not. When God promises justice, it will happen. It may not be immediate. It may take years, decades, even centuries, but no wickedness goes unpunished. For those who feel like injustice is winning, Nahum's prophecy is a reminder. God sees, God remembers, and when the time comes, his judgment will be total. So the question is, will we learn from Nineveh, or will we follow in its footsteps? Nahum's prophecy wasn't just about Nineveh's destruction. It was about why God had doomed the city in the first place. What makes a nation so wicked that God himself wipes it off the face of the earth? Nahum 3 gives us the answer. The crimes of Nineveh weren't just sins. They were atrocities. This wasn't about private moral failings or hidden corruption. This was about a nation whose entire system was built on bloodshed, brutality, and the suffering of the innocent. Woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims. Nahum 3:1. Nineveh wasn't just guilty, it was soaked in violence. Every street, every marketplace, every palace was built on the bones of the conquered. And yet, the people of Nineveh felt untouchable. But God had been watching, and his patience had run out. The Assyrians weren't just another empire expanding its borders. They were the most feared force on earth, and for good reason. When they conquered a nation, they didn't just take land, they made an example of their enemies. Their cruelty was legendary. Historians have uncovered Assyrian records that boast of their brutality. They skinned their enemies alive. They impaled prisoners on giant stakes, leaving them to die in agony. They stacked severed heads at city gates to strike terror into the hearts of anyone who resisted. They burned entire villages, leaving nothing but ash. And they were proud of it. They wanted the world to fear them. Nahum's prophecy was clear. God was about to do to them what they had done to others. I am against you, declares the Lord Almighty. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. Nahum 3:5. Nineveh had humiliated and destroyed other nations. Now it was their turn to be humiliated. One of the most haunting parts of Nahum's prophecy is how Nineveh refused to believe it could ever fall. They saw themselves as invincible. They had wealth beyond measure. They had walls that no army could penetrate. They had kings who ruled with absolute power. They thought they were untouchable. But Nahum reminded them of a sobering truth. No kingdom is safe from God's judgment. Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile with water around her? The river was her defense, the waters her wall. Nahum 3:8. Thebes was a mighty Egyptian city, protected by natural barriers just like Nineveh. But it still fell. And now Nineveh was next. Can you see the parallels to modern nations? How many world powers today think they're untouchable? How many nations build their strength on military dominance, wealth, and influence, believing that nothing could ever bring them down? But history tells a different story. Babylon fell, Rome collapsed, the Soviet Union crumbled, and Nineveh, it wasn't just defeated, it was erased. Nothing can heal your wound. Your injury is fatal. Nahum 3:19. When God declares an empire finished, nothing can save it. Nineveh wasn't destroyed because it was rich. It wasn't even destroyed just because it was powerful. It was destroyed because it was merciless. Many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses. Nahum 3:3. God takes the suffering of the innocent seriously. And when a nation builds itself on the blood of others, God doesn't forget. Look around today. Are we seeing the same warning signs? Governments that exploit the weak for power. Leaders who profit while the poor suffer. Nations that invade, destroy, and dominate without remorse. God doesn't ignore oppression. He never has, and he never will. Nahum 3 isn't just a warning to Nineveh. It's a warning to every nation that follows in its footsteps. God had sent a prophet to Nineveh before, Jonah. Back then, the people repented, and God spared them. But this time, there was no repentance, no second chances, just judgment. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall, for who has not felt your endless cruelty? Nahum 3:19. The world had suffered under Nineveh's cruelty, but when its judgment came, no one mourned. It's a chilling thought. What happens when a nation becomes so corrupt, so cruel, that the world rejoices at its downfall? Nineveh is gone, but its story is not over. The question is, will we learn from its fate or will we repeat its mistakes? Nahum's prophecy was a storm of destruction for Nineveh, but for Judah it was a sunrise after a long, dark night. The very nation that had terrorized them, enslaved them, and humiliated them was about to be wiped off the map. The message was clear. God had not forgotten their suffering. And this raises a powerful question. Is God's justice actually a comfort? For the oppressed, the answer is yes. When evil reigns unchecked, when tyrants seem invincible, when the innocent are crushed under the weight of corruption, Nahum reminds us that God is not blind. Justice may seem delayed, but it is never denied. But for the oppressor, for those who build their power on the backs of the weak, Nahum's words are terrifying because they reveal a truth no empire wants to admit. No one escapes God's judgment, not even the mighty. Nahum wasn't just speaking to Nineveh, he was speaking to Judah. The people of God had lived in fear of the Assyrians for decades. They had seen their neighbors slaughtered, their cities burned, their families taken as slaves. To them, Nineveh was not just a city, it was a monster. And now that monster was being slain. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him, but with an overwhelming flood, he will make an end of Nineveh. Nahum 1:7-8. For Judah, this was hope. It was relief. It was proof that their suffering had not gone unnoticed. God fights for the weak. God defends the powerless. God brings justice to the oppressed. This is why Nahum's name means comfort. Because for those who have suffered under the hand of evil, God's justice is not cruelty. It is redemption. Nahum's prophecy forces us to wrestle with a sobering reality. Does God still judge nations today? Or was this something that only happened in ancient times? Look at history. Every empire that rose to power through oppression eventually crumbled. Babylon was unstoppable until it wasn't. Rome ruled the world until it collapsed under its own corruption. The British Empire stretched across the earth until it weakened and fractured. The Soviet Union controlled millions until it collapsed almost overnight. No empire lasts forever. When nations abandon righteousness, oppress the weak, and turn their backs on truth, they are writing their own downfall. It's happening even now. We see the signs, the same sins that doomed Nineveh. Greed, arrogance, violence, corruption are alive today in nations across the world. And yet, world leaders act as if they are invincible. They think their wealth will protect them. They think their armies will defend them. They think their power will last forever. Nineveh thought the same thing. And where are they now? Nothing can heal your wound. Your injury is fatal. Nahum 3:19. When a nation reaches the point of no return, God doesn't have to send fire from heaven. He simply removes his hand of protection, and the empire collapses under the weight of its own sins. Nahum's prophecy wasn't just about Nineveh. It was a preview of something bigger, a glimpse of final judgment. The Lord will take vengeance on his foes and vent his wrath against his enemies. Nahum 1:2. Nahum paints a picture of a world where evil is completely wiped out, where every corrupt ruler, every abuser of power, every oppressor is brought down. And this is exactly what the Bible tells us will happen when Jesus returns. In Revelation 19, we see a warrior riding on a white horse. His name, Faithful and True. His mission, to bring justice to the earth. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. Revelation 19:11-12. This is Jesus as the conquering king, the ultimate fulfillment of Nahum's vision. The fall of Nineveh was just a shadow of what is coming, a preview of God's final victory over evil. And this leaves us with a choice. Nahum's message is clear. God will bring justice. The only question is where we stand when it happens. Are we like Nineveh, living in arrogance, blind to the warning signs? Or are we like Judah, trusting that God will deliver his people? The answer determines whether we face God's wrath or his refuge. Nahum ends with these words, "Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace." Nahum 1:15. For those who trust in God, there is hope beyond judgment. There is peace beyond destruction. There is a kingdom that will never fall. The question is, are we ready for it? No empire, no king, no nation that builds its power on violence, corruption, and arrogance will stand forever. Nineveh thought it was untouchable. Its walls were thick, its armies strong, its wealth limitless. But when God declared its time was up, no fortress could save it, and it was wiped from history. Nahum's prophecy is not just ancient history, it's a warning that echoes through the ages. The question is, will we listen? Today we see powerful nations rising on the same sins that brought Nineveh to ruin. Injustice, greed, oppression, and godlessness. They mock morality, celebrate evil, and act as if nothing can touch them. But God is watching. His justice may seem slow, but it is never late. And yet Nahum's message is not just about judgment, it is about hope. For those who trust in God, justice is not something to fear. It is a promise of deliverance. It means that the pain of the oppressed will not last forever, that evil rulers will not reign forever, that injustice will not stand forever. So the final question is, where do we stand? Will we trust in God's justice, or will we try to escape it? If this deep Bible stories video has given you a fresh perspective on the book of Nahum, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. We've also converted our most popular videos into eBooks, so check the link in the description. And if you'd like this video in eBook format, let us know in the comments. Nineveh ignored the warning. Will we?